Resident Evil 4 is by and large considered the best in the Resident Evil franchise. It marks an evolution of the series in terms of combat and game design, and forever changed the formula of Resident Evil games. That being said, does Resident Evil 4 deserve all the praise it has received for its innovations, or is it overrated? So the story of Resident Evil 4 is that the President's daughter is kidnapped and Leon is sent to find her. Why was only one man sent to find the President's daughter? I have no idea. Maybe the President didn't really want her found, so he put the least amount of effort necessary to find her. I mean, she is pretty damn annoying, so I can understand where he's coming from. Anyway, Leon finds her, but they've both been injected by the Plagueis parasite, which Sadler hoped to allow him to control Ashley and Leon when they return to the US. Which begs the question as to why he immediately tries to kill them after he tells them this information. I mean, their survival, or at least Ashley's, is the crux of his plan. Why jeopardize her safety? Well, long story short, Leon and Ashley find a machine to remove the virus from their bodies and end up killing Sadler. Resident Evil 4 is actually pretty light on its story. There are several cutscenes and radio calls between Leon and other characters that offer some exposition, but for the most part the main bulk of the story is discovered from reading the notes that you pick up. For players who are more interested in the gameplay aspect, this is obviously a good thing, as you don't have to sit through long-winded conversations and boring plot lines. On the other hand, if you choose to not read the notes, then when there is a cutscene you could end up being confused at what is going on. For instance, before Leon and Ashley find the room that takes out the Plagueis, there's a note that mentions that there's a machine that uses radiation that targets and kills the parasites. However, if you don't read the note and just continue on with the game, when you enter the room, Leon and Ashley just decide to hook themselves up to the machine without really saying what it does. Of course, you can infer what the point of the machine is from watching the cutscene, but it really wouldn't have been that difficult to maybe have one of the characters say something about how this is the machine that can kill the virus. Ada Wong also has her own campaign set alongside Leon's, aptly called Separate Ways. It basically just tells the same story from Ada's perspective, as she'll visit the same locations as Leon, fight the same enemies, and even do the same puzzles. It would have been nice if Ada's campaign had had a little more variation, seeing as how the first 3 chapters are just sections from Leon's campaign, but at the same time they didn't have to include it in the game at all, so it's nice that they did. It's also kind of interesting to see the story from another character's perspective. Even though Ada's story really isn't that necessary, it could have been worse. They could have made you play through the same story with 4 different characters after all. One of the most annoying characters in this game is Ashley, and what's even better is the fact that she's completely helpless and you're tasked with defending her during some of the toughest parts of the game. Several times you need to defend Ashley while she tries to activate a switch or tries to escape from enemies. Of course, instead of defending her, what usually ended up happening would be me shooting and killing her while enemies were trying to take her away. It would have been nice if they made it so she wasn't affected by her bullets, considering it's hard to get a shot off when she's in the way and is about to be taken away. The good thing though is that you're not stuck with Ashley for the whole game. In some cases, Leon will tell Ashley to wait while he goes on ahead, or sometimes she ends up getting captured again and you're offered respite from her. After a while, you do tend to miss her companionship. Maybe not. As a matter of fact, they can keep her. One thing I've missed from the later Resident Evil games are the puzzles. The puzzles in this game offer a nice respite from the combat, and although they're not the most difficult, they are pretty unique and fun nonetheless. And unlike the puzzles from previous games where you need to find 50 key items just to figure them out, these puzzles actually use things in the environment you are in to give you clues about what you're supposed to do. Unlike the enemies in previous Resident Evil games, the enemies in this game aren't zombies. As a matter of fact, they make that quite clear in the beginning. I think the fact that the enemies weren't zombies in this game works considering the overarching story. But that being said, the fact that they mostly got rid of the zombie motif is a little disappointing. Not only that, but the transition between enemies who are zombies and enemies who are infected with the parasite has been carried over into the more recent Resident Evil games. My real problem with this though is that these new enemies that have been introduced tend to sprout tentacles when they are attacked. Seeing as how I'm not a Japanese schoolgirl, I really hate the fact that sometimes when you shoot off an enemy's head, there's a chance that they're not really dead, and that you have to waste even more ammo disposing of them. You can't even use your knife to kill them since they'll usually stab you if you get too close. Another minor point of contention I have with these types of enemies is that they've become a series staple, as both Resident Evil 5 and 6 both have enemies like this on an increasingly annoying level. I absolutely hate the fact that shooting an enemy in the head is no longer a viable strategy for killing enemies, as there's always a chance that some little creature will pop out. Of course, in the confines of this game, I can accept the changes to the enemies, but I think it's important to just remember that this is the game that started with this whole transforming enemies bullshit. Resident Evil has always been about ammo rationing, as the game requires you to place your shots and if possible use your knife to kill enemies. Unfortunately, the concept of ammo rationing doesn't really work on the confines of Resident Evil 4, considering the combat has been completely revamped. The combat in older Resident Evil games usually involved you entering a room with one or two enemies, and you had the option to kill them or run away. Enemies were also slower, so it was easy to use your knife in order to kill them. There was also the fact that enemies couldn't freely move between rooms, as they were unable to open doors. Resident Evil 4, on the other hand, has completely changed the combat. Usually, when you enter a room or area, you could be greeted with a whole group of 5 or more enemies, in which it would be impossible to use your knife to attack. Not only that, but sometimes enemies are just too far to hit with anything but your gun. There's also the fact that getting close to enemies who have those little plagueis things will most likely result in your death. And in a lot of cases, the game doesn't allow you to progress through an area until you've killed a fair number of enemies, as it would be next to impossible to just run past them without getting attacked, or without them following you. The end result of this is that in some situations you will end up being low on ammo, and it's very easy to fuck yourself over. I think the game would have benefited from having fewer enemies overall, and more enemies that had unique ways to defeat them, like the Regenerators. I can honestly say that my favorite enemies in the game were the Regenerators. They were so creepy and grotesque in their design that when you heard or saw them, your heart started to race a little. What I like even more is that in order to kill them, you needed the thermoscope to see the little plagueis inside, otherwise they would keep regenerating the parts of their body that were shot off. I especially like the fact that they weren't overused, as there's only about 10 of them in the game. One thing I noticed when playing the game is how tight the areas are for the boss fights. My main qualm with this is that when the boss fight starts, you're usually standing right in front of the boss and backed against the corner, making your only option to run past the boss and hope that you don't get hit in the process. The combat in the game also doesn't really lend itself to the boss fights, as most bosses have long reaches and are able to move around with ease. It's also pretty difficult to get shots in, as you constantly have to move around to avoid getting attacked. Of course, the game tries to compensate for Leon's stiffness by including button prompts that you can hit that will allow you to dodge attacks. However, you only have a split second to react, and it can be annoying to have to dodge every 10 seconds. Now, one thing that I absolutely hate about this game are the Quicktime Events. There are two types of Quicktime Events: combat-based and cutscene-based. The ones on combat are usually used in order to dodge attacks or to kick a stunned enemy, and most of the time they work. Although sometimes I noticed that even if an enemy was stunned, the prompt wouldn't always show up. Cutscene Quicktime Events, on the other hand, appear during cutscenes. No shit, right? Most of the time they seemingly appear out of nowhere, and the penalty for missing one is an instant game over. There's nothing like missing a prompt and instantly dying just because you fucked up one stupid button press or jerk off motion in the case of the Wii version. Another small complaint I have about the game is the inventory system. Apparently Resident Evil 4 is not only a survival horror game, but also an inventory management simulator, seeing as how you have to constantly organize your inventory since the game doesn't automatically arrange items in the most efficient manner. Not only that, but you'll also be constantly bringing up your inventory, since it's the only way to change weapons, which is annoying considering how often you'll need to switch weapons depending on the situation. So now the moment of truth. Is this game overrated? No, I actually do believe that this game is deserving of all the praise it has received. At the time when it came out, Resident Evil 4 really was revolutionary for its over-the-shoulder third-person camera and precise aiming feature, both of which are still used in games today. Of course, it's worth mentioning that Resident Evil 4 is also responsible for some of the trends in Resident Evil 5 and 6, like Quicktime Events, enemies who transform when they lose limbs, and a more action-oriented gameplay. However, I don't necessarily hold the problems of Resident Evil 5 and 6 against 4, seeing as how those elements were on a smaller scale in Resident Evil 4, and the fact that Resident Evil 4 was able to retain some of its survival horror roots.